Well, this morning we had a nice long reading from the Gospel according to John concerning the man born blind. And normally one tries to talk about the entirety of the thing, but instead, for but a few initial sentences, I'm going to just grab verses 8 and 9 from the 47 that you heard and comment about those, and slightly out of context as well. This is actually one of my favorite stories from John's Gospel. I really love it. In short, the man born blind basically is cured, and he comes up to the Pharisees and he says, "You are a bunch of silly fools. What's wrong with you people? I was blind and now I see." But because that healing didn't fit into the way the Pharisees work, they ultimately cast him out. He was inconvenient to them. And such a story is so rich for preaching a sermon. But as I said, this morning I just want to head to verses 8 and 9. And here they are. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar said, "Is not this the man that used to sit and beg?" Some said, "It is he." Others said, "No, but he is like him." And he said, "I am the man." But before I concentrate on those words, I want to share with you a couple of stories, and one of them arises from something I found in my study at home a few weeks ago, when I decided that it would be a real gift to my family to clean out the office prior and not after the coroner comes to get me. Hopefully some years from now. The mere idea that my family would have to sift through the stuff in my study has kind of kept me awake. And so I bit the bullet and I started to toss things out. Of course, you really don't toss things out. What you do is you read each one and then you file it someplace. And you're going to toss it out later on, maybe. Thankfully, I ran across a sermon that had been preached by my extraordinary friend, late Bishop Otis Charles, the guy who ordained me a priest 36 years ago, and I had totally forgotten about this sermon. In a sermon that he gave in 1991, he recalled an occasion 20 years earlier in which he had been invited. He was a priest at that time from Connecticut. He had been invited to St. Mark's Cathedral in Salt Lake to preach and help introduce the new prayer book. The new prayer book, that 38-year-old red book that's sitting right in front of you in the pew. Otis happened to be part of the committee that originally wrote the thing. And part of this new liturgy he wanted to highlight, it was found previously in the trial rites dating back to the 60s and then into the books that we got in the 70s. And for those of you who've been around for a while, you remember this? It was called, remember what it was called? Green Book. That's how clever we were in the Episcopal Church back in the 60s. It was the first trial liturgy, and then we came up with one that had stripes on it. Remember what that one was called? Zebra. And then we left that and we went to a blue book, and guess what that was called? Yeah, you're great. It was called Blue Book. And so we went through these trial rites, and in that trial rite and then to the 76 book and finally to the 79 book, there was something called the peace. And the peace was that moment in which we greet one another in the name of the risen Lord. And that's going to happen again today, as it's been happening forever here in the church in a handful of minutes. But he was introducing that, and when he was talking to these folks 20 years later, Bishop Charles said the following in recalling an incident of introducing the peace. He said, "In introducing the peace, I suggested the congregation stand, look towards the furthest corner of the cathedral, and having identified a person they did not know, move from their place and greet that person." Well, following the coffee hour, the service at the coffee hour, a woman came up to me. She explained that she had been going through a most difficult time in her life. And when she got up that morning, she had felt the need to be connected with some other human beings. Her first thought was to go to the Unitarian church, which seemed to her less formal. But her rootedness in the Episcopal Church prevailed. and she came to the cathedral. She was absolutely overcome when, during the peace, someone actually came up to her, connected with her, and greeted her with the peace of Christ. It was a healing experience to her. Otis continued, God's creation works. We can say with certainty God's creation only works when all creatures, great and small, are connected, tamed in the sense of being friends. I love that phrase, tamed. The world is tamed when we become friends. It's a wonderful story he told that day. It was a breakthrough in this person's life simply to know another. It's that simple. That's the first story. Now I want to digress a little bit more and tell you a story involving my dad, a fellow who I believe was the greatest man that ever lived. Kay Lorenz knew him. He was the greatest man that ever lived. It was in December of 1970. This will also tell you Kay was not perfect. In December of 1970, when my brothers, both having returned for Christmas vacation from the University of Utah, joined me with our dad at the Rotary Club Father, Son, and Daughter lunch in the ballroom of the Rainbow Hotel in Great Falls. My mom happened to be at another table with her dad, my grandfather. The place was absolutely filled to the rafters. And all the men, remember this is some years ago when it was a men's organization, were invited to introduce their children. I remember this like yesterday. It became my dad's turn, and he said, "This is my son Barry, who is a senior at the University of Utah, majoring in journalism and working at KTVX television." And we were all pretty impressed because we had cable in Great Falls, and we got KTVX in Great Falls, so we knew him. He was a television star. And then he turned to my brother Craig and he says, "And this is my son Craig, who is a freshman at the University of Utah, and he is majoring in journalism, and he is also working at KTVX as a cameraman." And being a cameraman at a television station was kind of a romantic thing. I mean, that was pretty high church. And then he looked at me, and honest to God, he said, "And this is my son, this is my son," and I said, "Brad." And he looked at me and he said, "I have never called you Brad in my life. This is my son Bradley, who is a sophomore at Great Falls Public High School." And then we all sat down with Dad still a little bit grumpy over the entire thing. It was a moment to remember. My dear friends, I inherited my father's inability to remember names. I can look at the senior warden and I can't remember if her name is Heidi or Molly. I once tried to introduce the bishop and I could not tree his name in the lower branches in my mind to save my life. When calling one of my oldest daughter, and she will attest to this, I have been known to begin the attempt by running up to it with starting out with our dogs' names. Little Bear, no. Brandy, no. Jennifer, no. Christine. And I finally get it. How hard it can be to sometimes make a naming connection to someone else. And when we don't do that, as Otis's story said so powerfully, we can often really miss out. Who is that? Is not this the man who used to sit and beg? Some said, well, it is he. Others said, no, but he's like him. He said, I am the man. In order for us to really fully appreciate the company of Christ, the companionship in Jesus, we need to really know who we are, the collection of the forgiven and the healed and the sanctified. We need to know who the blind guy is who sits outside and begs. He's one of us. We are him. And part of that drill is to know each other's names and to greet each other in the peace with the richness of that story that was told by Bishop Charles in his sermon so many years ago. And to that end, in complete secret, Sean and I wrestled the courage necessary and conspired last week to make it possible. When you leave today, you will see that you have a name tag. Yeah, you do. And it will be your choice to fit the name tag with either a pin or with a magnet. It's your choice to fasten on you when you arrive next week. Either at the end of the service or coffee hour, you merely need to toss it into the box and we will have it ready for you the following week. We're a full-service church around here. Now imagine being able to go to someone you have seen for the last 10 years and now actually greet that person by name, the very name which Jesus knows you through baptism. Imagine looking at Michael and saying, no, that's not Derek. Derek's over there. Imagine looking at Barbara and realize it's not Paula, but I thought that was her name for all these years. This is really an incredible gift to people like me or folks new to the congregation. We no longer have to pretend. This morning at the 9 o'clock service, I said, isn't this a wonderful thing for the Picketts who just arrived here from Bozeman? And they reminded me their name is not Pickett, it's Puckett. And that was my star line for the day. One of my favorite political figures of all time is Nelson Rockefeller, the late governor of New York. He also was vice president to, anybody remember? Come on. Gerald Ford, yeah. In his biography, there's an account of his confessing he knew no one's name. And so he would just greet everybody with, hi, you fella. And they all thought, boy, he must really like me. He calls me with that familiar, hi, you fella. Well, we're going to be able to actually call another by name, acknowledging a companion in Christ, someone with those spiritual gifts that we don't have, but when combined with ours, make up the company of Jesus in totality in our midst. Why do we do this today? Well, it's Laetare Sunday, Rejoice Sunday in Latin, Rose Sunday in parts of Europe. This is the day that the Pope would enter the cathedral carrying a rose. It was a gold rose, but it was a rose. Lighten Up Sunday, informally within the Episcopal Church. Woohoo Sunday here at All Saints. Actually, it's not that, but it will probably be known as thus in a few years. We have flowers back on the altar. It's a break in Lent, when we can pull out the rose-covered Hawaiian shirt and go to the Dairy Queen in our breaking the fast, the normal Sunday practice in Lent, of course. But this Sunday, get a double nudge fudge brownie delight ice cream treat. And we can similarly absolutely revel in the fact that soon we can call a brother or a sister in Christ by his or her name. And if we can do that, then we can actually hear his or her story. And if we can get that, unlike the Pharisees, we will not inadvertently cast that person out, but rather invite our companion in Jesus to the fold, saying, tell me who you are and how I am so lucky in the name of Christ to be able to now know you as kin. Lent is all about reconciliation. And for some like me, this is a huge step in making that possible, because reconciliation is often achieved just by knowing someone else's name and going from there. Turns out it is in pretty simple stuff that we can find a new and wonderful Lenten discipline. So let us rejoice. Laetare Jerusalem. Amen.